from the internet and group them up in categories inside PureRef, so let's check them out and discuss them. The first image is already an extremely useful reference. It informs us of the two main variants of the weapon. On top, we see the earlier MP43 model, with a very monotonous bluing finish and a flat pistol grip. And below, we see the late-war SDG-44 model. This one is more visually interesting because of the disparity in the finish of the different pieces, showcasing the desperate nature of the manufacturing industry at the time. Personally, I would already make the decision to go for the lower model because of its material variety. These next references are also important. Because of their perspective and lack of background, they are extremely good as a background for modeling, especially the ones on top where we get a side view and the top view together. The ones on the right are also quite interesting as material references, and they're overall easier to read. Next up, we have more modeling references, some uncommon perspectives that are extremely useful when determining proportions. The front sight and barrel tip, the rear sight from the top, the magazine with a visible follower, and finally the whole weapon from below. We also have some pictures of disassembled parts that will serve us to learn how the different pieces of the rifle are connected. Moving on, we find some ideas for possible weapon attachments we can model as a bonus. An optical sight with a mount and leather covers, and an extremely rare and cool device to shoot around corners. Granted, the picture quality is not the best, but we get the idea just fine from them, and can later look for other references to clarify them a bit more. Then we have our main texture references. On top, we have a completely blued version that is kinda boring, but has enough detail and depth for us to nail the material, with both clean and rusty parts. Below, we have a sample of the late war model with its distinctive material variety. I especially like the contrast between the blued upper receiver and the more yellowish lower receiver, with a different, duller finish. We also have some interesting wood references for the stock, which have definitely seen better days. Next up, we see some close-ups that can serve as references for the wear and tear. Scratches, bumps, rust, and grime accumulation, etc. To wrap up the texturing references, we find a variety of weapon markings. From serial numbers and quality assurance stamps to a cool handmade inscription on a magazine, these markings will give a lot of character to our gun. Moving on, we have a modern replica of the gun. These are kinda unrealistic to use as modeling references. Since manufacturing methods are different, the shape language of the weapon changes quite a bit, losing a lot of its softness and becoming too sharp. That said, the very new looking materials can give us an idea of how the original weapons looked and felt right out of the factory. Finally, we get some staging ideas for our final rendering presentation. Both the tabletop picture and the one leaning against the log are pretty good, and also give us an idea of what secondary assets we can use. Ammo, a helmet, magazines, pouches, disassembled pieces. Here are also some references for the original magazine pouches of the gun, in case we decide to model them too. Organic elements like these cloth props give a much needed shape contrast to our hard surface weapons. Our second group of references belong to the Japanese Nambu Type 14 handgun. We begin with some parts diagrams and a drawing, which are great for modeling specific parts that might be hidden in pictures. Special attention to this section drawing on the right. These cuts are amazing to understand how mechanisms interact with each other and see the inside of parts that no picture can show, like the pin mechanism, the shape of the barrel chamber and rifling, and the position of bullets and follower inside the magazine. These are especially useful when making the weapon's animations, as they clearly show where the rotation points are for the mechanisms. Some important references we forgot in the previous weapon are the bullets. These are one of the few components of which we know the exact measurements, down to the tenths of a millimeter. Another piece of information that is very easy to find online is barrel length, so combining these two numbers and the proportions from other pictures, we have a good starting point to determine the true size of our weapons inside our modeling package. Next up, we find our main modeling references, because of their quality and clarity. In this case, they are also our main material references, since they display great wood and metal materials with interesting variation. To narrow down more characteristics we want in our model, I will settle already on some project decisions. We want to use the wooden grip with carved stripes, which will give us more possibilities when texturing and possibly sculpting some nice wood damage. Regarding the wood color, we want something warm and bright to create visual contrast with the blued metal. Brighter wood also makes wood gradients and stains more apparent, which will benefit the final look of our gun. The warm red wood from the right-hand image is perfect, highlighting the cuts and displaying gradients on the borders. I would also choose the longer trigger guard instead of the circular one. I think it looks more interesting and it further distinguishes the Nambu from other similar handguns like the Luger. Moving on, these next references are not great as a whole, but show some interesting details. The first one has a nice soft wear on the receiver's finish, probably caused by hand placement during regular use. The second one has a really cool deep scratch on a wooden grip that would be nice to recreate on our gun if we decide to make it more beat up than new. Same for the third one, which shows nice stains on the metal that we can use to break up these flat surfaces. Number 4 has very interesting stains between receiver and grip, which we could use to tie our materials together. Number 5 shows some good damage on the wood, maybe even a bit too much. We might want to use it depending on the overall level of wear we want on the weapon. The next group of pictures show good references for grease accumulation in the crevices of the weapon. Below, Group 7 shows a good example of metal edge wear, although this could be because the bluing itself is too aged and dark, causing it to contrast more. Finally, the last group shows with good detail the milling marks left on the surface of the metal by the manufacturing process. In order to show the difficulty of the reference gathering process, I decided to leave in some bad references to explain why they were discarded. The first group shows an ambu with boring metal and wood materials, very flat colors and damage, and almost no gradients. The second one has a kind of interesting worn-out bluing finish, but the way in which it's worn out is very noisy and would detract from our main materials and shapes if we decided to replicate it. On the third and last one, although the rust itself looks interesting, its shapes are too even, cloudy, and yes, noisy too. They also lower the material contrast between metal and wood, making the overall object less appealing. Finally, we find good potential staging ideas for our weapon presentation, and also references for a potential accessory, a vintage leather holster we can use as dressing in the final renders, to contrast with the pistol's materials. Our last small group of references is from the Italian SPAS 12 shotgun, a classic weapon from pop culture which is present in many video games. Modern firearms tend to limit us a bit more creatively speaking. Overall, they are more uniformly made and with a higher quality control bar, so they don't really deviate too much from one another. Their metal and polymer materials don't allow much variation, different polymer colors and maybe some surface treatments like paint or camouflage materials. Because of this, if we want to make our modern weapons original, we need to focus on different facets like interesting wear and tear, gloss variation, and customization items like custom parts, tape, attachments, or storytelling trinkets. First of all, we have our main references for both modeling and texturing. Any clear picture with enough quality will do really, as long as shapes and materials are defined enough to see their little differences. For this weapon in particular, we will need to be cautious while texturing all of those black elements to avoid breaking PBR, and we will need constant testing in the final render conditions to make sure they look deep and not like washed out grays. This second reference looks good at first glance, until we notice the small detail of its orange tip, giving it away as an airsoft replica. These replicas can be extremely realistic, to the point orange tips are mandatory in some countries to make it easier to tell it's not real at a glance. We will need to be on the lookout for these replicas and make sure they stay out of our reference searches, since they will not be accurate to the real thing in ways that are difficult to tell. These next references show some cool wear and tear, mostly scratches on the material finish that show the bare metal below. If they have enough resolution, we can even get some alphas and stencils directly from pictures that we can later apply on our projects. Moving on, these references show the shotgun from an angle, catching highlights which are essential for us to determine the glossiness variation of the materials. Again, the absence of big color variations in modern firearms make these gloss variations a necessary way for us artists to add flavor and material definition to them. Finally, we have this sling as an accessory example we can add to our final model, maybe wrapped around the gun somewhere so we can make it static.